at how the FBI infiltrated and investigated racial justice groups and the racial justice movement during the summer of 2020, which for 2 years now has always been an open question, which is how did the FBI respond to the racial justice movement, given the context that the FBI had previously designated black political activists as so-called black identity extremists or anti-government extremists. And what's significant about this is that the FBI in Denver, according to internal FBI recordings or internal FBI reports and undercover recordings, hired a convicted felon with a history of sexual assault and menacing with a weapon to infiltrate these groups while being paid thousands of dollars. And the shades of COINTELPRO that are part of this rise from the fact that Mickey Windecker, the informant, ended up becoming a leader in the protest movement, just as we saw informants in the 1960s and 1970s during COINTELPRO become leaders in those movements, and then accuse other leaders, or the real leaders of these groups, of being informants, a practice called snitch jacketing that was used to devastating effect against black political groups in the 1960s. And that's exactly what happened in Denver. Mickey became a leader of the racial justice movement there, accused real leaders of being informants when they were not, and then once he was in a position of leadership, attempted to entrap local activists in crimes, in some cases violent crimes. In fact, Mickey and the FBI went so far as to try to stitch together a supposed plot to assassinate Colorado's Attorney General, Phil Weiser, which ultimately went nowhere, but shows you the scale that the FBI had in trying to manufacture a plot that activists could get behind that would then reveal these activists as being violent. And I think it's important to understand the context in which this happened. In 2020, the Trump administration at the time was really beating the drum on this idea that Antifa and Black Lives Matter activists were potentially violent. This was a narrative that was being reinforced and echoed by right-wing media at the time. And what you're seeing in these undercover recordings is the FBI essentially trying to make that possible and happen. Ultimately, that does not happen. Obviously, there was no assassination plot or attempt against Phil Weiser, the Colorado Attorney General. But the FBI, using this paid informant, went to extreme lengths to try to make that happen. And as for the question of whether this happens on the right, it does. You know, obviously there have been other plots that have targeted right-wing activists. The most well-known right now is the plot that targeted a group of men in Michigan in a supposed plot to kidnap Governor Gretchen Whitmer. And so I think what's important about this story now is that we are entering this phase when Jim Jordan and the Congress are about to launch this committee that is specifically looking to establish this narrative that the FBI is solely focused on this type of tactic against right-wing groups and right-wing political activists, when that isn't true. What ultimately is true is that the FBI has an enormous amount of power that deserves a lot more oversight than it currently receives, and all sorts of groups from left to right are subjected to this kind of activity by the FBI. And so this narrative that the right wing is attempting to establish, that the FBI is prejudiced against right-wing groups and we're only seeing this activity among right-wing groups, there is evidence of that, and no doubt Jim Jordan will find it. But the truth is that this is far more extensive. It involves many groups, and in most cases, I would argue, if you look at the history of prosecutions in the post-9/11 era, these types of tactics are used far more against left-wing activists and left-wing political groups than they are against right-wing groups.
Even though the intelligence committees have found that it is domestic terrorism, far right-wing, that is the greatest threat to the United States right now. And you're talking about the Select Subcommittee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government, chaired by Representative Jim Jordan of Ohio. That's meeting on Thursday. But let's turn to a video capturing when FBI informant Mickey Windecker met with his FBI handlers. By the way, he's denying he's an FBI informant. Met with his FBI handlers before he met with the Denver activist Zeb Hall.